Welcome to the debate. Today we're tackling a really foundational challenge. It sits right at the intersection of our most advanced technology and, well, our most vulnerable human psychology. The question is, how do we truly resolve complex institutional and interpersonal conflict? We have to move beyond this very limited choice between just relying on technology or, on the other hand, resorting to destructive, high arousal confrontation.
Yeah, and that requires a difficult synthesis. So today we're drawing on three really distinct but convergent bodies of material. There's the recent advances in large language models, LLMs, specifically around reliable reasoning. Then there's the psychology of institutional stress, using places like academia as a case study. And crucially, there's the neurophysiological research on stress regulation and de-escalation training, particularly in high-stakes jobs like policing.
Exactly. So the core question that comes out of all this data is really one of priority. When you're faced with deep institutional or social stress, where should you focus your energy? I mean, does the evidence support prioritizing, say, algorithmic transparency and deep reasoning using AI's capacity to show us objective truth? Or should we prioritize mastering physiological self-regulation and de-escalation, learn skills like heart rate variability control? I'm going to argue that AI-driven clarity and transparency have to be the primary focus.
And I'm going to maintain that unless the individual's equipped for internal control, unless they prioritize that fundamental physiological regulation, any external clarity, it just doesn't matter how objective or deep it is, it's simply unusable. Self-mastery has to be the indispensable precondition for any kind of effective conflict resolution.
Well, my core thesis is built on the reality that human conflict, especially at an organizational level, it's often just a symptom of structural flaws, of huge informational asymmetry, and frankly, poor, inflexible decision-making. AI is emerging as really the only tool that can scale to provide the structural critique we need and drive reliably rational action. And we see this best in the latest LLMs, which are moving beyond simple pattern matching. They use a technique called instance adaptive scaling. To simplify it, instead of treating every query the same, the AI can dynamically adjust its computational effort. It essentially thinks longer about harder problems. This signals a shift from, superficial retrieval toward real, deep, reliable reasoning on complex tasks. This is what gives us the objective truth needed to cut through all the emotional or politically managed noise. And furthermore, just consider the evidence around institutional stress. When you're dealing with immense pressure, with chronic overwork, what one source calls academia's toxic love language, the clarity from an AI could be transformational. It offers the transparency needed to expose these flawed structures, maybe by modeling workloads against objective outcomes. This lets the individual consciously reframe how they engage. It lets them see the environment as just a job and, crucially, to separate their self-worth from institutional validation.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. The structural problem must be illuminated before the individual can effectively cope. I agree that structural problems must be illuminated, but the data warns us that illumination is, it's irrelevant if the recipient's ability to use that information is degraded. The most reasoned, instance-adaptive solution from any LLM is it's static if the human receiving it is operating under high physiological arousal, or PA. High PA is the state we see in, uncontrolled fighting or war. It's fundamentally maladaptive for complex problem solving. Research shows the state leads directly to impaired decision-making that's described as, and I'm quoting here, impulsive, disorganized, and inefficient. What's more, it causes tunnel vision, auditory exclusion, and a severe impairment of cognitive flexibility. If a conflict resolution strategy bypasses the body, it fails. It just fails entirely. So the foundational solution has to be self-mastery. We often get threat responses wrong.
The adaptive human response isn't just fight or flight. There's often a third, crucial state, freezing. Now, the sources describe this not as passive helplessness, but as attentive immobility, a state used for active action preparation and risk assessment. Mastering this shift, which we can train using heart rate variability biofeedback, it actively restores prefrontal control. And that's precisely what's needed for complex action.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that.
Let me tell you why. Unless the body is managed, the most compelling argument from an LLM will be completely lost to physiological tunnel vision. Okay, let's pivot to the utility of that clarity then. You concede AI offers objective data. Let's use the example of uncovering salary discrepancies in a company. Now, I agree this transparency creates friction. It makes people uncomfortable. But I argue that friction is absolutely necessary. It forces groups to move past perceived roles, past assumptions, and establish a genuine mutual self-interest as the basis for negotiation. If the goal is resolution, we need truth, even if it's destabilizing for a moment.
I come at it from a different way, specifically drawing on the sociological data about dramaturgy in public life. The idea is that social interaction is like a performance, right? We have a front stage and a backstage. The sources warn that in this context, AI-driven political transparency, where every single data point is visible, can be severely corrosive to trust.
How so? I mean, if the data is objective, why would visibility erode trust?
Because it creates a world with literally no backstage. When every interaction, every negotiation feels monitored or managed by algorithms, the psychological response is fascinatingly counterintuitive. People start to see their environment as a total simulation, where authenticity is impossible. This state of constant managed performance, it just fundamentally erodes public trust in genuine communication. And what's the result of that? An increase in negative affect and stress, which immediately pushes the person right back into that high arousal state, completely negating the value of the data you just revealed.
That's an interesting point about the sociological implications, and I do acknowledge that tension. But is the solution then to reinforce the performance that's hiding institutional decay? I mean, that sounds like an argument for willful ignorance. The whole point of the AI's deep reasoning, using that instance adaptive scaling, is to provide an objective truth baseline. We have to use that to force accountability, not just manage perception. We can't let the fear of short-term discomfort override the need for long-term structural honesty.
We're not arguing for ignorance. We're arguing for the functional capacity to act on that honesty. Look at the police training data. It's all about highly charged human interaction. The efficacy of proven de-escalation tactics like honesty, listening, and emphasizing humanity, it rests entirely on the individual's ability to maintain low arousal. If the officer's heart rate spikes, they lose the capacity to do those nuanced, flexible tasks. The research on VR training for this is powerful evidence for my side. It showed that voluntarily upregulating your HRV through biofeedback in a stressful simulated context is a highly trainable skill, and critically, this skill demonstrated FAR transfer. It improved professional performance assessments outside the game. So this learned physiological mechanism for conflict mitigation, it precedes any external information. It just ensures the human is a reliable receiver and actor.
Okay, I see why you emphasize that FAR transfer and the reliability of training the nervous system. And physiological regulation it's undeniably essential in a crisis. But I believe that prioritizing it as the primary path reduces the individual to a purely defensive posture. At its heart, adopting the just-a-job mindset or mastering the active preparation of freezing is a self-preservation strategy. The active action preparation from freezing is momentary. It buys you seconds. That interval must be filled with reliable, flexible decision-making that addresses the core systemic problem. If an advanced AI can provide near-instantaneous, context-appropriate deep reasoning, and we know this reduces human error, why would we rely solely on the fallible human nervous system to generate the optimal response in that high-pressure moment? The structural solution requires superior reasoning.
But the evidence shows the reverse happens. High stress causes people to truncate their cognitive process. They rely on impulsive, often inaccurate decisions. And even more specifically about the technology you're championing, the research shows that high-stress participants rely on surface-level aesthetic cues, what they call surface credibility, rather than actually evaluating the tech's underlying expertise. So think about that sociological concern. AI, by introducing this extreme transparency, could erode trust or increase perceived surveillance. And that risks pushing users into a stressed, impulsive state where they disregard the sophisticated output altogether. I mean, if the user only trusts the AI because the interface looks pretty, because stress hormones are flooding their system. All the benefits of your instance adaptive scaling are completely wasted.
This brings us back to the question of the bottleneck. The sources consistently suggest the problem isn't the AI's reasoning, that's advancing rapidly, but human limitations, the social performance, the dramaturgy, our cognitive limits under stress. So the solution is still to attack the source of the problem, which is systemic opacity and poor input. We should be leveraging AI's growing ability to think longer, to move past superficial, human-mediated responses and provide genuinely unbiased input. This objective input is the only way to genuinely tackle chronic institutional rejection or deep-seated conflict. Self-regulation helps you survive the toxic system. Transparency helps you dismantle it.
That's a compelling argument for structural change, but have you considered that the successful training data for conflict resolution shows the opposite sequence is effective? We have to first train emotional regulation in action. The police VR studies showed a measurable 32% average increase in HRV. That's manual control over the nervous system. And that restored physiological calmness is what enables the user to activate and use those higher-order cognitive processes. The evidence suggests the path is inherently sequential. Calmness precedes clarity. You cannot effectively integrate objective input if your body is literally screaming fight or flee and diverting resources away from your prefrontal cortex. The data provides solutions for institutional problems only if the individual is internally prepared to receive them.
So what you're arguing is that even if AI provided a fully reasoned, optimal solution to a major conflict, it would fail if the receiving party was stressed.
Not that it would fail entirely, but that the human recipient would likely degrade that solution into an impulsive decision. A calm mind can utilize complex information. A stressed mind just defaults to simple survival strategies. We have to secure the foundation of human function first. AI is a powerful tool, but like any tool, its utility is constrained by the operator's state.
So the difficulty in achieving genuine conflict resolution, it seems to lie in overcoming structural opacity and flawed, emotionally driven human reasoning. And while self-regulation is vital for individual coping, the rapid advancement of LLMs toward deep, reliable reasoning promises a clarity that can fundamentally reset the terms of engagement. It can expose the institutional failures that are the root cause of these conflicts. Focusing on external truth offers a path to permanent systemic change.
Resolution, however, is a human act, and it depends entirely on our biological capacity to process that information without cognitive degradation. The proven ability to train HRV control and master that defensive freezing response, it demonstrates that prioritizing self-regulation and de-escalation is the only viable pathway to ensure that sophisticated external information, whether it's from AI or anywhere else, can be utilized effectively in the moment.
Well, this exchange really highlights the challenge of integrating machine precision and objective truth with our profound human vulnerability. The listener has to weigh which foundation is more critical to build upon for lasting resolution, external clarity or internal preparedness.
Indeed, and the path forward requires synthesizing these, but the sequence matters immensely. There is clearly much more to explore in this material, especially around the true nature of trust and stress in our digital age.
You know that feeling, right? The big presentation, that crucial conversation, the moment where your heart just starts pounding and your mind goes completely blank. We all just call it pressure. But what if you could actually train for it? What if technology could build a gym, not for your muscles, but for your nervous system? Okay, let's dive into this because it's a fascinating idea. First things first, we have to ask the most important question. When the pressure is really on, what is actually going on inside your head and in your body? Because believe me, it is so much more than just a feeling. All right, here's our game plan. First, we'll break down how your brain reacts to pressure. Then, we're going to look at a pretty cool new way to train our stress response using the heart. After that, we'll get into why a believable simulation might actually be way better than a realistic one. We'll also ask how stress changes our trust in tech. And finally, we'll pull it all together to see what this means for the future of being prepared. So our journey really starts here, deep in our own biology. When we think we're in danger, our body's ancient fight or flight response just takes over.
And this isn't just a mental thing, it's a massive physiological event that gets us ready for action. But it comes with some serious downsides for our ability to think clearly.
Now check this out, because the effects are incredibly specific. For professionals like police officers, this high-stress state can lead to worse shooting accuracy and something called decreased inhibitory control. That's a fancy way of saying it's harder to not do something, like pull a trigger impulsively. It also causes real physical changes like tunnel vision and a total loss of situational awareness. I mean, under pressure, you literally see and hear less of the world around you. So if that's the problem, what on earth is the solution? Well, this is where things get really, really cool. Instead of just throwing up our hands and accepting it, researchers are asking, can we actually train our nervous system to handle stress better? Can we build up a kind of physiological resilience?
And the key to all of this is a metric called heart rate variability, or HRV. Now, it's not about how fast your heart is beating, it's about the tiny little variations in time between each beat. A high HRV is a great sign. It means your nervous system is balanced, it's adaptable, it's linked to feeling relaxed, and, this is the crucial part, keeping control of your prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of your brain, even when you're totally stressed out.
Okay, so how do you train HRV? Well, a team of researchers built this incredible tool for Dutch police officers, a biofeedback game in virtual reality. They didn't want to just talk about stress management in some quiet classroom. They wanted to train officers to control their own physiology while they were in an active, stressful situation. And this is just a brilliant illustration of how it works. Officers are in this VR zombie shooter game. At the same time, sensors are tracking their breathing and their HRV. When their stress levels go up and their HRV drops, their field of view inside the game physically gets smaller, just like real-life tunnel vision. So to win, they have to consciously slow their breathing and calm their heart rate to open their vision back up. It's a direct, almost instant feedback loop. So let's just walk through this biofeedback loop. It all starts by measuring your body's signals in real time. Then, the game instantly analyzes that data to figure out your stress level. The magic happens in the response. The VR world physically changes. And that forces you into the final, most important step, regulation. You're not just playing a game anymore. You are actively learning how to master your own internal state. So, the big question, did it work? Oh yeah, it absolutely did. The results were pretty remarkable, actually. The average in-game heart rate variability of the officers in the test group shot up by 32% from their first training session to their last. That is a massive improvement in their ability to stay calm and in control in the middle of a chaotic environment. Okay, so let's move on, because making an effective VR training tool isn't as simple as just copying reality. There's actually a very specific, very intentional design philosophy behind it. I mean, this is what we all assume, right? If you want to get people ready for the real world, you should make the training simulation look as real, as photorealistic as you possibly can. But it turns out, the research says that can actually backfire. Yeah, it turns out that chasing perfect realism can create way more problems than it solves. For one thing, tons of people get motion sickness in hyper-realistic VR. And then you've got the whole uncanny valley thing, where avatars that are almost human just feel creepy. On the other hand, if you aim for believability with something like a stylized zombie game, it's actually more effective. It's way more engaging, and it gives the researchers a clean, repeatable environment to train people in. And this really gets to the heart of it, which the researchers summed up perfectly. Just trying to slap more reality onto a simulation, well, it often fails. It turns out a well-designed, engaging experience is a much, much better teacher than a perfectly realistic one that's full of flaws. So this brings us to an even bigger and, I think, fascinating question. We've seen how we can use tech to train for stress, but how does being stressed out change our relationship with technology in the first place? Does it change how we decide whether or not to trust a new tool? To try and figure this out, another study put people through a digital stress test, and right after they were all worked up, they were shown a new security app and asked how much they trusted it. The researchers really wanted to know if that feeling of pressure would change how people made that judgment call. And the result was honestly pretty surprising. The study basically concluded that when it comes to forming our initial trust in a piece of tech, being stressed out doesn't really seem to matter. The stressed out group and the calm group base their trust on the exact same things. So, what this means is that our core rules for evaluating technology are surprisingly stable. Things like, does this seem credible, or is this actually useful? Those are the building blocks of trust. And their importance doesn't just go away because our heart is pounding.
For anyone designing critical tech, that's huge news. Just focus on the fundamentals, because they'll hold up even when things get tough. Okay, let's bring all these pieces together. We've talked about the biology of stress, a new way to train for it, and how our trust in tech seems to hold up. So, what are the big takeaways for the future here? Let's just quickly recap the 4 key points. First, stress isn't just in your head. It's a physical event that literally gets in the way of clear thinking. That means managing it is a physical skill. Second, and this is the really hopeful part, we can actively train our nervous system using tools like biofeedback. We can literally build emotional muscle. Third, the best gym for this training might not be a perfect copy of reality, but an engaging, believable game that focuses on the skill itself. And finally, it looks like our basic trust in technology is incredibly resilient, which is great news for anyone building tools for high-stakes situations. And that leaves us with one last thought to chew on. This technology used a zombie game to train police officers for their reality. So, if you could use this kind of biofeedback training for your own life's pressures, public speaking, tough negotiations, maybe even just rush hour traffic, what would your zombies be? What are the challenges you'd want to train your nervous system to conquer?
Greetings and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our listener today, the learner, is curious about something I think we've all felt, this strange paradox. Why do we spend so much time learning complex skills, gathering all this data, only to just throw it all out the window for the simplest, quickest option when the pressure is really on?
It's that moment the whole system just seems to crash.
Yeah.
Right? We build these, sophisticated mental frameworks for when we're calm. But the second acute stress hits,
Everything changes.
everything changes. We default to simplicity.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to unpack today. Not as some kind of moral failing,
Yeah.
but as a deep biological, behavioral, and ultimately a systemic reality.
And that's our mission for this deep dive, to really get the logic behind that simplicity. We have an amazing stack of sources, some cutting-edge research using VR to study police decision-making.
Which is fascinating stuff.
Totally. And we have studies on how stress messes with our trust in technology. And then on the flip side, these dense legal sources about how the system actively rejects simplicity when it comes to evidence.
Exactly. We'll look at what drives us toward that simple path,
Yeah.
the fight or flight response, and then explore the really complex systems society has built to force us to be rigorous again.
Mostly through the legal system.
Mostly, yeah. A system that demands complex reasoning, even when a simple fact seems, completely undeniable.
Okay, let's unpack this. And I think we have to start not with what we do, but with what's happening inside our bodies. With the biology, we have this kind of Hollywood idea that high stress sharpens the mind, that it gives you this laser focus.
Right.
But the research paints a very, very different picture. What does that kind of acute physiological arousal actually do to our ability to reason?
Well, what's so fascinating is that it actively impairs what scientists call higher-order cognitive processes.
Okay, what does that mean in plain English?
That's your analytical mind, your executive control. It's a part of your brain that can pause, weigh different options, adapt to something new. And when your system gets flooded with stress hormones, those are the very first things to go offline.
So it's a trade-off, a zero-sum game.
It is. The body is prioritizing raw survival speed over, depth of thought. The faster you can react, the less likely you are to get eaten by the tiger, so to speak.
And the body is just optimizing for that, for fight or flight.
Exactly. And the cost of that optimization is huge. The research shows that under stress, people overwhelmingly rely on habitual reflexes and these sort of intuitive judgments. They completely bypass conscious, careful reasoning.
So high arousal almost always means poorer decisions.
Consistently. The decisions are described as impulsive, disorganized, and inefficient. It's just not a state conducive to complex thought.
And this is where the idea of tunnel vision comes in. Is that just a phrase or is it a real physical thing?
It's both. It's a great metaphor for what's happening mentally, but it's also a documented physical reality.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Acute stress severely limits cognitive flexibility. And in the VR training studies, for instance, they observed that the visual field literally narrows. You physically stop processing information in your periphery. And if you can't see the complexity around you, physically and mentally, what are you left with?
Just the simplest, most direct thing right in front of you.
Exactly. The simplest option for action.
Okay, so to really understand why this happens, we need to get into the weeds of the biology. Let's trace the actual chemical and neural pathways that that guarantee this cognitive crash happens?
Let's do it. We can start with the body's ancient alarm system, the HPA axis and the fight-or-flight response.
The HPA axis, that's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis.
That's the one. When you perceive a threat, it kicks into gear along with the autonomic nervous system, or ANS, which is just a beautifully tuned survival machine.
So walk us through the chemical response from the ANS. That's the source of that immediate explosive feeling.
That's it. It's driven by the release of chemicals called catecholamines. You've heard of them. Epinephrine and norepinephrine.
Adrenaline and noradrenaline.
Exactly. Think of epinephrine, adrenaline, as pure fuel. It hits the liver and stimulates something called glycogenolysis, which is just a fancy way of saying it rapidly breaks down your stored energy.
To power your muscles.
To power your muscles for immediate defensive action. It's that biological command that just screams, move now.
And what about norepinephrine? How does that play into this narrowing of our thinking?
Norepinephrine is critical for focus, but in a very restrictive way. It's produced deep in the brain, and it jacks up your arousal, your vigilance, and crucially, the narrowing of your attention.
So it's actively filtering things out.
Actively. It's getting you ready to face one specific immediate threat. So it heightens your awareness of that one thing while telling your brain to ignore everything else. It's the cognitive start of that physical tunnel vision.
And at the same time, the HPA axis is pumping out cortisol. We hear a lot about cortisol as the stress hormone.
We do. And while it's important for recovery over the long term, its immediate presence is a signal of a sustained state of alarm. And that has the effect of further suppressing your frontal lobe functions.
Which is the part of the brain responsible for all that complex reasoning we just lost.
The very same part.
So we've got the hormones that fuel this response. What about the brain's wiring? The sources talked about neural connections that actually bake in this preference for speed.
This is where it's really interesting. The neural studies pinpoint these specific structural biases in the brain towards impulsive action.
Like a pre-built shortcut.
A perfect way to put it. They highlight connections between brain regions, specifically what are called the vermis vestigial limbic connections. And these circuits are strongly linked to this motivational push to respond in a fast and automatic manner when you feel provoked.
So if you have stronger connections in that pathway, you're more likely to react without thinking.
Precisely. Higher functional connectivity there doesn't mean you're a better thinker. It reflects an intrinsic neural bias toward reactive aggression, or just impulsive action. The speed is already programmed in.
But what about the brakes? Doesn't the brain have a way to monitor its own emotional state and, calm itself down?
It does, but stress seems to cut the brake lines, so to speak. We see this when we look at a region called the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex, or SGACC.
Okay.
The SGACC is like the brain's internal emotional dashboard. It monitors your arousal. And the research shows that reduced connectivity between the reactive part of the brain, the vermis, and this emotional brake pedal is linked to higher testosterone and more reactive aggression.
So if that connection is weak, the automatic response it takes over.
That's exactly what the research suggests. The cognitive control center gets decoupled from the automatic response system. So stress, both chemically and physically, disconnects the very machinery you need for controlled, reasoned behavior.
And it leaves you with just a simple, immediate reaction. We can actually measure this resilience, can't we? Through heart rate variability or HRV. What does that tell us?
HRV is a fantastic metric for this. It's a really sensitive measure of your parasympathetic nervous system, the rest to digest side of things. When high arousal hits, your HRV plummets.
But if you can keep it high, you're performing better under threat.
Right. A sustained HRV indicates a kind of cognitive resilience. It means your body is managing to maintain some internal balance, even when there's chaos outside.
And if your HRV drops, what are the real-world effects of that?
Well, your ability to stay balanced it dissolves. Low HRV is associated with this increased susceptibility to negative emotional processing.
Meaning small problems feel like huge crises.
Exactly. Ambiguous information is immediately interpreted as a threat, pushing you toward that simple reactive response. And physically, your blood vessels are constricting, your fine motor skills are getting worse, and even your ability to communicate verbally is impaired.
So you can't think clearly, and you can't even articulate a complex command if you wanted to.
You're not just thinking simpler. You're acting and speaking simpler, too.
This paints such a clear picture. We seem to be biologically hardwired to reject complexity when we're under threat, which brings up the really interesting question. Can we train ourselves out of it?
That's the million-dollar question.
And how does all this theory actually play out in the field? Or at least in a high-tech VR simulation of the field.
That is the perfect pivot to part 2, the simplification default in action. Because these high-pressure VR training scenarios for police officers, they give us hard data on this.
And they can measure everything in there.
Everything. They can track physiological arousal, every decision, every word spoken, and what they found confirms this fundamental shift to simplicity.
So what did they see? When officers were in a high-stakes scenario, say, dealing with a confused person holding a knife, what did they do?
Overwhelmingly, they took the path of least cognitive resistance. They defaulted to the most straightforward de-escalation behavior there is, which the researchers labeled verbal use of force.
Meaning just simple, direct commands.
Simple, direct commands. Stop. Drop knife. Get on the ground. It requires almost no interpretation of the situation. It's just an immediate assertion of authority.
And was this just their opening move, or was it their whole strategy?
It was the dominant strategy, period. It was the most common behavior overall, and it was always the first thing they did when they encountered a suspect in every single simulation.
It's the automatic reflex.
It's the reflex.
Which means they were ignoring the more complex strategies, the ones that require real patience and cognitive effort.
Completely. The strategies that demand nuance, like asking for information.
You know, trying to figure out what's actually going on.
Right, or emphasizing humanity, trying to connect with the person on a human level. Those were used far, far less.
Can you give us a specific number, just to show the scale of this gap?
I can. In one of the scenarios, a really intense one, officers used that simple verbal use of force 10 separate times.
10 times, right.
And in the same scenario, the number of times they tried asking for information or emphasizing humanity.
Let me guess.
0.
0. 10 simple commands versus 0 complex conversations. The data just screams that when the stakes are high, the biological push to simplify just overrides everything else.
That is a stark contrast. But you mentioned something really counterintuitive about their arousal levels. We've been saying high arousal is bad for thinking, but is there a sort of sweet spot?
There is, and that's the finding on the arousal sweet spot. The study found that officers were actually more likely to use any kind of de-escalation behavior when they were at a medium level of physiological arousal.
So a little bit of stress is actually good. It gets you focused.
It seems so. There's a functional level of arousal that you need for peak performance. But the very highest levels of stress are inhibitory. They shut you down. The optimal state for thinking is somewhere in that middle zone.
Okay, let's get to what I think is the most critical insight from this research, because it's a huge contradiction. The study involved training officers to get better control over their physiology, their HRV.
That's right. But that training failed to stop a bias that was triggered by a very simple external cue. Let's spend some time on this because it feels like the heart of the problem.
It really is. It shows the limits of just training the individual. So the officers went through this training to improve their HRV, to give them more cognitive resilience under pressure, and on a physiological level, it worked.
They were calmer, more in control internally.
Yes. But then they went into the simulation. And right at the start, they were given a simple external piece of information, a dispatch priming bias.
What does that mean? What was the cue?
The dispatch call that sent them to the scene was framed with high-threat language. It basically primed them to expect a violent, hostile person before they even arrived.
And even though they were physiologically calmer because of the training,
it didn't matter. Even the officers who successfully maintained a high HRV were still completely driven by that initial, simple, high-threat frame from the dispatcher.
So the simple external information beat the complex internal training.
It steamrolled it. The simple cognitive category, this is a high-threat situation, won out. It suggests the drive to simplify isn't just an internal failure of control. It's a cognitive shortcut, triggered by the simplest data you can get your hands on.
That is a stunning finding.
It's a powerful testament to the logic of simplicity. Once that simple frame is set, it's incredibly hard to break out of it.
Okay, let's shift gears a little. Let's go from those life or death moments to something more mundane, like traffic control. The pressure there is about volume and speed, not an immediate threat. Does the same simplification happen there?
It absolutely does. You see the same pattern of cognitive simplification, just driven by different pressures. In traffic surveillance, officers have to make hundreds of rapid, low-stakes judgments.
Who to pull over, who to watch.
Right. And to do that efficiently, they employ strategies that minimize cognitive load. They use what are called fast and frugal heuristics.
Mental shortcuts.
Exactly. A really common one is the availability heuristic.
That's relying on whatever comes to mind most easily.
Precisely. So an officer might remember a briefing that said, "Be on the lookout for a blue sedan." And for the rest of their shift, every blue sedan they see triggers a little mental flag. It's fast, it's efficient, but it can be incredibly biased.
And what about the recognition heuristic?
That's even simpler. It just suggests that if you recognize one thing and not another, you'll naturally give more weight to the one you recognize. So in surveillance, an officer might focus on a car that just looks out of place based on their gut feeling, rather than analyzing all the cars equally.
Experience becomes the shortcut. They can just rapidly categorize things.
Yes, using what's called the recognition prime decision model. And it leads to a clear preference for what the sources call visual simplicity.
Meaning they focus on things they can see easily?
Right. Obvious, simple violations. A car that doesn't signal, someone drifting into the bus lane. These are simple visual facts that require no cognitive effort to process.
And they prefer that to the much harder task of trying to figure out a driver's intentions.
Of course. The brain always seeks the path of least resistance. And this tendency extends beyond just actions. It fundamentally affects how we evaluate information and who or what we trust.
Which brings us right into the digital world. How does stress warp our judgment of the technology that's presenting us with information?
The research on this is fascinating. Studies on security tech show that stress is a huge moderator of how we evaluate trust.
How so?
Under high stress, the influence of what's called surface credibility goes way up.
Surface credibility.
Yes, simple peripheral cues. Does the app look sleek? Is the design professional? Is it easy to use? When we're stressed, we lean on those simple aesthetic cues to decide if something is trustworthy.
And as the importance of those simple cues goes up, I'm guessing the importance of something else goes down.
Exactly. The influence of actual expertise plummets.
Which is complex.
Expertise is incredibly complex. It's about technical specs, peer-reviewed testing, the deep mechanics of how the system works. When we're stressed, we just don't have the cognitive bandwidth for that, so we default to the simple, shallow signals.
So whether it's an officer on the street or us looking at a new app on our phone, stress makes us favor the simple, surface-level stuff over deep, complex analysis.
It's a universal principle.
That gives us a really solid bridge from our biology to our behavior. So let's zoom out now to the bigger systemic level, part 3. The complex truth or transparency in the digital age.
Right.
Because AI and digital surveillance, they seem to promise this, the simple, total truth, a shortcut to complexity on a massive scale. But there's a paradox, isn't there? This total transparency can actually destroy trust.
That's the core sociological tension. The digital world makes information delivery incredibly simple. Everything is right there, but it makes the information ecosystem as a whole vastly more complicated and untrustworthy.
And the sources use a concept from sociology to explain this, dramaturgy.
Yes, from Irving Goffman. It's a powerful metaphor for what's happening.
So break that down for us. What's the core idea of dramaturgy?
Goffman used the metaphor of a theater. He said we all operate on a front stage, which is our public performance for everyone to see, and a backstage, which is our private reality, where we can be ourselves. Historically, both of those stages were separate and real.
But technology has basically torn down the wall between them.
It's completely erased the backstage. Pervasive surveillance, social media, corporate data collection. It's created this radical political transparency where there is no more off-the-record space. The simple truth is everywhere all the time.
So if the genuine backstage is gone, what do we get instead?
We get curated authenticity.
A performance of being authentic.
Exactly. Instead of raw reality, every moment becomes a carefully constructed performance designed to project a certain image. You see a politician's casual family photo on social media. That's not a backstage moment. That's a highly optimized front stage performance designed to look like one. And that constant simulation is what kills public trust.
Because if everything is a performance, how can you trust any simple revealed truth?
You can't. And AI algorithms are the stagehands and directors of this whole performance. They amplify the curated content, they optimize messages for engagement, they allow for this incredibly specific micro-targeting.
And they amplify the simplest messages because those get the most engagement.
Precisely. It connects right back to our biological bias. The simple, surface-level political performance is the one that succeeds in the digital ecosystem.
But this brings up a really interesting contradiction within AI itself. On one hand, it can give us these simple, powerful truths. It can find the smoking gun in a trove of documents, for example.
Right, it's a shortcut to discovery.
But when we ask AI to solve truly hard problems, does it also default to that simple, fast approach?
No. And this is where the need for complexity just reasserts itself. The latest research is clear that for hard problems, things with ambiguity, lots of variables, unpredictable outcomes, relying on simple, fast retrieval is not enough.
It's not reliable.
It's not reliable. So, to make AI truly accurate on complex tasks, engineers are now designing it to do the very thing that humans abandon under stress,
Which is?
to spend more computational time thinking. They call it adaptive reasoning. The AI models use these complex internal iterative loops to check and recheck their own work.
So the very tool that gives us simple answers relies on deep internal complexity to be trustworthy on the things that matter most.
Exactly. The complex system demands complexity, even if the user just wants a simple answer.
And that really sets up the final tension in all this. We have our biology pushing us towards simplicity, technology offering us these simple, curated truths. But when does society as a whole step in and say, no, that simple truth is not good enough?
And that brings us to part 4, the legal demand for complex reasoning.
This is the ultimate roadblock for the simple approach.
It is. It's the non-negotiable societal constraint. The legal system, especially international human rights law, just fundamentally rejects the idea that a simple revealed fact is automatically valid or just.
And this is so crucial. A piece of surveillance might reveal a truth, but getting that truth admitted as evidence in a court is a whole different ballgame. It has to go through this incredibly complex legal framework. Why? Why is the method so important?
Because a simple truth that's obtained illegally undermines the very system of democracy it's supposed to be serving.
Okay.
The sources are adamant about this. You must have a human rights compliant legal framework. The way you collect the information has to respect fundamental human rights, or the information is just. It's inadmissible. It's thrown out.
So even if it's a video that undeniably proves someone committed a crime, if the police broke the law to get that video,
The court can't see it. The rule of law is more important than the efficiency of that one investigation.
and this forces a kind of complexity back into the process.
It forces due process, warrants, oversight. It's a systemic break on the impulse to just get the simple answer by any means necessary.
Let's talk about a method that technology makes incredibly simple. Bulk data collection, just scooping up everything. From a purely investigative standpoint, that seems like the easiest way to find what you're looking for. How does the law complicate that?
It complicates it immensely. This is the problem of bulk collection. The law says that bulk, pervasive, or systematic monitoring is a violation of rights.
Why? What's the logic there?
Because, as the sources put it, mass data collection has the capacity to reveal private information far in excess of its constituent parts.
Unpack that for us. Far in excess of its constituent part.
Okay, think of it like this. One record of a phone call you made is a simple fact. One location ping from your phone is a simple fact.
Right.
But if I collect all of your phone calls, all of your location pings, all of your web searches for an entire year, what do I have?
A complete picture of my life.
A profoundly complex and private portrait of your life, your political beliefs, your health problems, your relationships. The sum of all those simple acts creates a complex reality that you have a right to keep private.
So the law demands precision.
It demands precision. Go after specific records with a warrant, not the whole haystack.
And yet, we still have this problem of low protection for metadata.
It's a huge legal loophole. The metadata, who you called, where you were when you called them, what websites you visit, is often more revealing than the content of the call itself. But legally, it's often had far less protection.
Which seems completely backwards.
It is, and
Yeah.
courts are starting to recognize that. There's a strong push now to require a probable cause warrant to get access to that kind of non-public information. Again, it's about imposing a high cognitive barrier, the legal process, to access simple data that reveals complex truths.
And then there's the final layer of legal complexity, which is when governments try to find a simple workaround to their own complex laws.
You're talking about the circumvention of constitutional protections.
Exactly.
This is a huge issue in transnational intelligence. A government might be legally blocked from spying on its own citizens. So what do?
They ask another country to do it for them.
They ask a partner nation with looser laws to conduct the surveillance and then just share the data. It's the simple route to the truth. And it completely bypasses their own country's complex framework of rights.
And international bodies are fighting this.
Actively. The UN General Assembly, the European Parliament, they're all challenging this because it reduces fundamental rights to a simple jurisdictional trick.
Which brings us back to the big question. If our biology and our technology are both pushing us towards simple, direct truth, why does the legal system insist on being so complicated? Is it just bureaucracy?
Not at all. The complexity isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's a deliberate defense mechanism,
How so?
because that complex legal reasoning validates the underlying integrity of the entire system, not just the truth of one isolated fact. If we let the simple, powerful truth override the complex framework of rights and due process,
The whole system falls apart.
the whole foundation of democracy and the rule of law crumbles. The complexity is there to protect us from the temptation of simple, efficient, but ultimately excessive control. It forces reflection and accountability.
It's the resistance.
It's the resistance against the logic of simple power.
So if we tie all of this together now, what really stands out is this essential constant tension between our human desire for immediate, simple action, our biological default, and our societal need for slow, reflective, complex structures.
We saw it in the biology. Under threat, our brain just opts for the shortcut. The police officers in the VR simulation default to the simplest commands because the cognitive cost of anything else is just too high in that moment.
And we saw that this drive is so powerful that it makes us trust things based on how they look, not on their actual expertise.
Right. And then there was that profound finding from the VR study.
The dispatch priming.
The dispatch priming. That even with complex internal training to control your physiology, a simple external cue can wipe all of it out, which suggests the solution has to be about more than just individual self-control.
And then we saw that even when technology hands us a simple truth on a silver platter, that truth is completely worthless as legal evidence without the most complex human design regulatory systems in place to validate it.
The simple truth is fast, but the complex, validated truth is what delivers justice.
So what does all this mean for you, the learner? I think it means recognizing that simplicity is incredibly powerful, and sometimes it's necessary for survival. But it's also inherently dangerous.
It's dangerous because it's so prone to bias.
Exactly. So the biggest challenge in this high-speed, high-stress world isn't finding the simple fact. It's having the cognitive resilience and maybe the moral resilience to demand complex reasoning when fairness and justice are really on the line. It's knowing the difference between simple information and valid evidence.
Which leaves me with a final, provocative thought. If our best self-control training, like the HRV training, fails to beat a cognitive bias that's triggered by a simple external cue,
Right.
then maybe the most effective defense against this dangerous logic of simplicity isn't about improving our individual self-control at all.
What is it then?
Perhaps the real solution is in designing better external systems. Unbiased, highly complex systems, like those rigorous legal standards, that intentionally force complexity and nuance back into the process, protecting us from our own worst, simplest impulses.
Something profound to mull over until our next deep dive.
Indeed.
Until then, keep digging.
Welcome to The Critique. The material you submitted argues that high-pressure situations push us towards simple actions, but legal complexity gets in the way of using that simplicity as evidence.
And it's that tension that's so interesting.
Exactly. So let's dig right into the structure of that argument. Okay, so what I really like about the opening is how clearly you establish that core conflict. You've got this strong case for how physiological arousal really impairs our higher-order thinking.
That habitual reflexes part.
Right. And the data on the police officers is so vivid. Under stress, they just default to verbal use of force, that simple command style.
Instead of the harder, more complex de-escalation tactics.
Exactly. It's a fantastic example of our biological simplicity default. But then, as I read it, the argument sort of shifts gears. It moves to AI and legal rules almost like they're just separate roadblocks.
And that's the opportunity. The overall argument would be so much stronger if you explicitly define that biological default to simplicity as the one universal challenge that everything else, the law, the AI, is specifically designed to overcome.
Ah, so you're saying instead of just an observation, the police officer data becomes the foundational problem for the entire piece?
It becomes the antagonist, yeah. Right now it reads a bit like three separate sections that are just, thematically linked.
Right.
But if you weave that biological finding through everything, then the simplicity default is the central problem that these advanced systems have to actively fight against. It really elevates the whole critique.
I can see that. It gives the reader a single, clear intellectual foe to track. But how do you make that leap from, say, police instincts to abstract international law without it feeling arbitrary?
With sharp contrasts. You framed the legal side not just as an obstacle, but as institutionalized complex reasoning.
Okay.
So, for example, when you introduce the legal constraints, you put that immediate, simple human reaction, that verbal use of force, directly against the state's complex requirements.
Side by side.
Exactly. You show that the state demands a human rights-compliant legal framework to validate any truth. That contrast immediately shows why the system has to be complex. It's the price of integrity.
That's very actionable. It grounds the entire legal argument in a very human, physiological reality right from the start. Okay, let's look at the next section on AI and transparency. The material makes a good point, aligning AI with political transparency.
Revealing things from the backstage.
Right, like salary data. It's a solid point for AI as a simple truth teller. However, the research you included also notes that for hard problems, just retrieving an answer isn't enough. These AI models are now being designed to spend more time, more computational effort on adaptive reasoning.
And that fact feels a little disconnected at the moment, doesn't it?
It does.
Because that's the crux of it. To really reinforce your theme, the AI section should pivot to explore the irony that the very tool we expect to give us simple, transparent truth is now structurally required to adopt the complexity that human stress tries to bypass.
That's a fascinating angle. So adaptive reasoning isn't just a technical detail. It means the system has to slow down. It can't just pull the first answer.
Precisely. That shift in AI design is the missing piece of the argument. You can use it to set up this powerful, contrasting parallel with the human condition.
So while high stress pushes a person away from complex thought,
The AI, when it faces a hard problem, is forced to move toward complexity, to be more accurate, more reliable.
it's the direct inversion of the biological response. The human takes the shortcut to save resources, but the machine has to deliberately add cognitive load to get it right.
Yes, and that contrast deepens the entire thesis. So, to make it actionable, when you're discussing AI, you state that this shift toward adaptive reasoning is, well, it's a technological version of necessary complex thought.
Okay, so you'd contrast it directly.
You'd put the police officer who defaults to low-effort verbal force right next to the AI system that has to deliberately use complex thought to avoid spitting out a simple but unreliable truth.
That is a much more powerful point than just saying AI reveals secrets. It shows that even our most advanced systems learn that complexity is the only way to tackle a complex reality.
Exactly.
Moving on to the legal implications. The core point here is really counterintuitive, that evidence can be inadmissible regardless of its truthfulness.
Which is a great hook.
It is. It challenges the reader, but I think they're left wanting to know the specifics. We get that a human rights compliant legal framework is needed, but we don't really see why it has to act as a barrier against what seems like simple truths.
And there's a risk there, right? That the audience might just see all that legal complexity as, bureaucratic red tape getting in the way.
Yeah, exactly.
So to really underscore the power of complex reasoning, the piece needs to use those specific, granular legal standards to show the reader why procedural complexity must override simple factual truth.
We need to make complexity the hero of this section, not the villain.
That's it. You have to illustrate why the system is built to protect rights through these complex processes rather than just rubber-stamping facts that might have come from, say, unchecked surveillance.
And this feels like the perfect place to bring in the research on surveillance tech.
Absolutely. Use the details you have on metadata. You can pull directly from the Court of Justice decisions in your sources. You could point out the court's concern that metadata can be extremely revealing about individuals' lives.
And that it gets very low levels of legal protection.
Right. And then you add the constraint that agencies shouldn't be doing bulk, pervasive, or systematic monitoring, and that any material gathered that way should be inadmissible.
So by including those specifics, we're showing the complexity isn't arbitrary. It's a direct response to the simple but dangerous technological solution of total surveillance.
It's the ultimate expression of your theme. The legal framework demands complexity, oversight, specificity, precisely where technology offers a simple, all-encompassing answer. It shows the law is fighting the very same simplicity default as the officer under stress, just on a huge systemic level.
So, a key theme running through this whole critique is that powerful tension between our default psychological drive for simplicity and the structural need for complexity in any robust system.
Whether it's an advanced AI or a human rights legal framework.
Right. Your material is at its absolute best when it leans into that tension.
And the actionable suggestions are all about restructuring to really exploit that. First, frame that physiological default from the police data as the universal challenge for the entire piece.
The central problem.
Second, use that AI trend toward adaptive reasoning as this kind of perfect inverted counterexample. Even tech has to embrace complexity for hard problems.
And third,
use the specific legal constraints, the stuff on bulk monitoring and metadata, to show why complex checks and balances are absolutely critical, even if they override a simple truth.
we genuinely appreciate the level of detail you provided in your submission. We look forward to seeing your revised material when you're ready to submit it again.
Welcome to the debate. Today we're going to be talking about a really fundamental conflict in decision-making under duress. It's this cognitive friction that happens when high-pressure, stressful situations force us, as humans, toward simplicity, toward an immediate action. And the question we really face is whether our most complex systems, legal frameworks, professional protocols, advanced technology, can or even should accommodate this primal drive.
Right. And the core tension there is, does this biological need to simplify our reasoning under stress completely short-circuit the foundational need for complex, higher-order evaluation in professional fields? Or is accepting this simplification just a necessary operational truth that our institutions have to integrate to make sure things get done?
And I'm going to argue that biology really dictates the outcome here. Stress fundamentally impairs higher-order cognition, and that makes simple, straightforward approaches like relying on reflexes or mental shortcuts a necessary operational default. And, it often yields faster and sometimes even more precise results in these high-stakes environments.
And I'll be maintaining that despite that powerful biological pressure towards simplicity, complexity has to be rigorously maintained in our systems of validation. Because, look, immediate reactions and simple truths, they frequently lack credibility, accuracy, or lawful compliance. So our institutions have to insist on sophisticated evaluation, even if that, imposes friction on speed.
So I think we have to start with the mechanism itself. When an individual, let's say a police officer, faces an acute threat, the body kicks off the stress response. It triggers what we call the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal pathway. And this flood of cortisol and adrenaline, it's explicitly designed to narrow focus to prioritize immediate survival, fight or flight, at the direct expense of executive control and sophisticated analytical skills. The research on this is, it's pretty unequivocal. When you demand complex processing under these conditions, decisions become, and I'm quoting here, impulsive, disorganized, and inefficient.
Okay, but that inefficiency is exactly where the institutional failure begins, if we just passively accept it. The consensus across so many of these studies is clear. High levels of physiological arousal are, almost always, associated with significantly poor performance when the task requires nuance.
In the context of the policing simulations we've looked at, high arousal levels correlate directly with one single, overwhelming default strategy, a reliance on direct, forceful commands, what's categorized as verbal use of force. And that to me is the epitome of a low-effort, simplified tactic that's chosen when the brain just can't handle anything more complex. I see that reliance not as a failure, though, but as a necessary operational truth. When your cognitive resources are so constrained, the brain just selects the path of least resistance. Officers who are engaged in critical operations, they rely extensively on what behavioral science calls fast and frugal heuristics. These are, low-effort mental shortcuts, like the availability heuristic, which uses easily and quickly recalled information, or the recognition heuristic, which simplifies choices based on familiar patterns. These shortcuts are used precisely because they allow professionals to select options rapidly and, I'd argue, effectively when time is the ultimate constraint.
But I challenge that premise that these shortcuts are truly effective or precise in these complex scenarios. They're just fast. If we look outside of human biology for a second at advanced technological problem solving, even sophisticated AI that's tackling hard problems is being designed to reject simple retrieval. These models have to use adaptive reasoning. They're being built to spend more computational time thinking, precisely because an immediate heuristic-based output just isn't sufficient to ensure reliability and accuracy. The system requires complexity to achieve real validity, not just speed. So why should human professionals be held to a lower standard than our machines?
Well, sure, but I think that comparison misses the unique pressure of time in a physical conflict. A machine can deliberate for milliseconds, right? A person facing an immediate threat has to act now. And when we transition this conversation to data and transparency, the simplicity argument gets even stronger. Digital technology, just by its nature, creates this radical form of political transparency. It makes the backstage, the private, hidden reality, immediately visible. It leaves no off-the-record space. The raw, unfiltered truth that's exposed by rapid data collection, or even by a quick, reflexive perception, is profoundly valuable. It aligns perfectly with the quick, unfiltered cognitive state that stress induces. It just cuts through the noise.
That's a compelling argument for the existence of raw truth. I'll give you that. But I would frame its utility within a regulated system very differently. The simplicity of raw, quickly gathered evidence is severely limited by institutional complexity and specifically by the role of law. If we're talking about using that data as evidence, especially in high-stakes environments like international courts, the sources emphasize that a human rights-compliant legal framework is absolutely essential.
But why should the technical complexity of a legal framework negate a demonstrable truth? If bulk surveillance data gathered quickly and simply proves a fact, should we just ignore it because the collection process wasn't, complex enough?
We ignore it because its simplicity fails the test of validation. Material gathered quickly, without oversight, through bulk, pervasive, or systematic monitoring. It's often deemed inadmissible as evidence, regardless of how truthful its content actually is. The complexity of legal reasoning, adherence to due process, proportionality, and necessity is required to filter and validate that simple information. Without that higher-order institutional framework, the simple truth you prioritize is, frankly, legally useless. The institution must maintain that complexity to ensure its own legitimacy.
I understand the legal constraint, I do, but if we acknowledge the inevitability of this acute stress response, that higher-order cognition is impaired in the field, doesn't the institutional responsibility then shift to acknowledging and mitigating the operational impact of that biological fact? I mean, we can't legislate away the HPA axis. We have to train for a simplification that is effective.
See, I challenge that interpretation. The entire purpose of professional training is precisely to build resilience and to force complexity under duress, to, push back against that HPA response. Look at the data on virtual reality biofeedback VRBF training. Studies have successfully trained police trainers to voluntarily regulate their physiological state, specifically their heart rate variability or HRV, even under high arousal in an active game context. This learned in-action control actually transferred to performance assessments outside of the VR environment. This shows that the complex skill of physiological self-regulation can be engrafted onto an individual to counteract that simple reflexive panic response.
I agree that the overall physiological control improves. The self-efficacy data is strong on that, but I really question the depth and the transferability of that complex training, especially when you're confronting these ingrained cognitive biases. The studies themselves noted specific, complex cognitive failures that just persisted. If we look at the bias that was induced by the radio dispatch priming, where officers were cued to expect a hostile body type, this priming caused false alarms much more frequently when an innocent target just happened to match that presumed hostile description.
But the total number of false alarms dropped significantly because of the training.
Yes, the overall performance improved, but the specific, simple bias induced by that priming,
It stayed constant throughout all the training sessions, despite the drop in general errors. And that suggests that while complex training can offer surface improvements in arousal management, those deep-seated, simple, reflexive biases are incredibly resistant to complex cognitive training. The default simple reaction, in this case the biased reaction, it remains intact under pressure.
Then we have to iterate the training. If the bias persists, the complex training just hasn't gone deep enough to challenge the root assumption. We have to insist on complexity because the trade-off in operational tactics is just too severe otherwise.
Okay, so let's talk about that trade-off. Because I would argue that the prevalence of simple tactics like verbal use of force isn't a failure of training. It's a rapid, accessible response that's used precisely when cognitive resources are critically strained. In high-stress encounters, officers overwhelmingly adopt this simple action immediately, and then they consistently pair it with another simple tactic, which is honesty, during the detainment process that follows. That pairing suggests a reliable, direct communication strategy that's adopted when the whole system is under acute load. This is functional simplification in action.
Functional simplification that costs legitimacy and effectiveness in the long term. We have to consider what is sacrificed when the simple command prevails. The same high-stress simulations show that more complex, nuanced de-escalation behaviors, specifically asking for information and emphasizing humanity, were frequently just not recorded or utilized by officers who were exhibiting high arousal. These complex dialogue-based skills are exactly what modern policing requires to be effective.
But that assumes officers have the cognitive bandwidth for a dialogue in that moment of crisis. The biological evidence says they just don't.
Then we have to structure the system to demand that bandwidth or redesign the encounter entirely. We have successful models that demonstrate the value of demanding complexity. Consider dialogue policing in Denmark. They adopt a complex, respectful, dialogue-based approach that actively prioritizes de-escalation and nuanced communication over immediate, forceful commands. And the evidence shows that this leads to increased legitimacy among citizens, fewer arrests, and a reduction in confrontations. That model confirms that when institutions insist on a complex communicative approach, the outcomes are superior.
The Danish model is certainly an aspirational goal, but it's built on sustained low arousal environments. My argument addresses the operational reality of the crisis moment, where physiological response dictates an immediate narrowing of attention and a reliance on low-effort, immediate reflexes. The data shows that even with intensive training that's aimed at increasing physiological control, those simple, reflexive behaviors and biases persist under high arousal. Effective systems have to acknowledge and integrate this operational necessity for speed and simplicity in the field. To ignore it is to demand the impossible.
And to accept it without complex filtration is to accept unreliable evidence, flawed judgment, and professional failure. We cannot allow operational simplicity to dictate systemic validity. Institutions must insist on robust, higher-order frameworks, be they legal, analytical, or advanced behavioral training protocols, to filter, validate, and guide action. This ensures that simple, immediate responses don't become detrimental flaws in the overall system. We have to insist on complex scrutiny to make the simple truth actionable and trustworthy.
The evidence for me compels us to integrate the necessity of a swift, simplified response into our operational planning, because that biological constant is powerful and so resistant to change.
And the evidence equally demands that the rigorous complexity of verification and justification must be maintained by our institutions to ensure lawful compliance and accurate outcomes.
So the debate remains. How much intellectual friction is complex reasoning allowed to impose on high-speed, high-stakes decisions before that pursuit of validity just becomes an obstacle to necessary action?